There is a drawer in almost every British kitchen that nobody opens anymore. It sits underneath the cutlery, jammed shut by things that once felt essential. A hand crank, a rusted blade, a gadget shaped like something between a torture device and a toy. If you grew up in Britain between 1950 and 1979, you know exactly what I mean. And today we are opening that drawer, one object at a time. Because these 20 gadgets were not just tools, they were promises. Promises of a faster kitchen, an easier life, a modern home. Some of them delivered, most of them did not. And by the end of this video you will understand something most people never stop to consider. The story of the British kitchen is not really about food at all. It is about who was expected to stand in that kitchen, for how many hours, and why. Think about the sheer variety hiding in that one drawer. A hand crank whisk next to an electric carving knife. A jelly mold shaped like a rabbit sitting beside a wall-mounted can opener bolted straight into the plaster. 30 years of British domestic history, compressed into a few square feet of cupboard space, most of it now gathering dust, waiting for someone to finally clear it out. Let us start where it all began. Not with convenience, with effort. Number 1. The rotary hand whisk. Before electricity found its way into every British kitchen, whisking egg whites for a Victoria sponge or a meringue meant turning a hand crank for minutes at a time, your wrist aching, your patience tested. Historical footage from British domestic archives shows just how physically demanding this simple task was. It was not unusual for a woman in 1952 to spend nearly an hour a day on tasks like this alone. The rotary whisk was not a luxury item. It was standard equipment in nearly every home, because there was, quite simply, no alternative. Number 2. The wall-mounted meat mincer. Sunday lunch in Britain was sacred. A joint of beef or lamb, roasted slowly, shared around the table. But the leftovers could not go to waste. On Monday, that meat went through the mincer, a heavy iron contraption clamped directly onto the kitchen table. You fed lumps of cold meat into the top, turned the handle, and watched minced meat emerge from the front, ready to become a shepherd's pie or a cottage pie. It sounds almost archaic now, but for millions of households it was the difference between a meal and waste. Now pay attention to this, because it matters. Every single one of these gadgets before 1960 was built around one assumption: that someone, almost always a woman, had the time and the physical stamina to operate it by hand. That assumption was about to be challenged. Think about what that actually meant day after day, year after year. No shortcuts, no machines to lean on, just the same repeated motion, the same aching wrist, done quietly, without complaint, because it was simply what a kitchen required of you. There was no romance in it. There was only routine, and routine, repeated for decades, becomes almost invisible to the people living inside it. It takes distance, the kind we have now, looking back from outside that world, to actually see it clearly. Number 3. The Kenwood chef. Invented by a man named Kenneth Wood, this stand mixer arrived promising to do almost everything. Stuffing sausages, peeling potatoes, mixing cake batter, whisking cream. It was marketed as liberation itself, a single machine that could replace a dozen manual tasks. For many British households, owning a Kenwood chef was a genuine status symbol, sitting proudly on the kitchen counter like a trophy of modern living. But here is the detail almost nobody talks about. The Kenwood chef did not reduce the number of hours women spent in the kitchen. It simply changed what those hours were spent doing. The kitchen got faster. The expectations got higher. Because once a family owned a machine capable of that much, ordinary cooking no longer felt like enough. If you could stuff your own sausages and bake 3 cakes in an afternoon, why wouldn't you? The machine did not free anyone from the kitchen. It quietly raised the bar for what a kitchen was supposed to produce. That is the pattern you will see again and again on this list. Every new gadget promised less work. Very few of them actually delivered it. Number 4. The Goblin Teasmaid. If there is one object that captures British domestic obsession more perfectly than any other, it might be this one. An automatic tea-making machine, sitting on the bedside table, complete with an alarm clock that would wake you gently, and then, without you lifting a finger, begin brewing a fresh pot of tea. The technology existed as early as the 1930s, but it became a genuine cultural phenomenon through the 1960s and into the 1970s. Waking up to the sound of boiling water and the smell of tea was, for an entire generation, the definition of comfort. By the 1980s, it had already started to feel old-fashioned. But ask anyone over 60 today, and their eyes will light up at the mention of it. There is something almost tender about the whole idea. A machine built not for productivity, not for saving hours of labor, but purely for comfort. For the small, specific pleasure of not having to leave a warm bed before your first cup of tea was ready. In a decade obsessed with speed and modern efficiency, the Teasmade stood out as something gentler. It did not promise to make you faster. It promised to make the first few minutes of your day feel just a little bit kinder. Number 5. The wall-mounted can opener. In the 1950s, this fixture was bolted directly to the kitchen wall, giving housewives the leverage needed to open large, stubborn tins without straining their wrists. It could be flipped away from the wall when needed, then pressed flat again to save space. It sounds almost industrial by today's standards, but in a decade when canned food was rapidly becoming a staple of the British diet, it was considered essential engineering. Canned peaches, canned soup, canned stewed steak. Rationing had only recently ended, and tinned food represented something close to abundance for families who remembered years of doing without. Long dedicated tool for opening those tins was not excessive. It was a household investing in its own newfound access to plenty, one sturdy metal fixture at a time. Number 6. The cookie press. Also known as a cookie gun, this device became especially popular through the 1950s and 60s. You filled a metal tube with soft dough, then squeezed it through a patterned nozzle to create neatly shaped biscuits in seconds. Brands producing these tools became household names during their peak, and the tradition of using them, particularly around Christmas, has never fully disappeared. Somewhere in Britain today, someone's grandmother is still pulling hers out of a cupboard once a year. Number 7. The electric carving knife. Picture the scene. 1970-something, a family gathered for Sunday dinner, and instead of a simple carving knife and fork, the father of the house wields a buzzing, vibrating electric blade to slice through the roast. Contemporary British television described it, without irony, as a genuinely terrifying invention. It promised precision. What it usually delivered was noise, mild chaos, and a story that got retold at every family gathering for years afterward. There was something almost comic about the gap between the promise and the reality. The advertisements showed clean, effortless slices falling away in perfect symmetry. The lived experience, more often than not, involved gravy splattered slightly further than intended, and a father figure defending his new gadget against a chorus of gentle mockery from the rest of the table. It rarely made carving easier, but it undeniably made Sunday dinner more memorable. But this is where it gets more interesting than a simple list of forgotten objects, because as we move into the 1970s, something shifted in British kitchens. It stopped being only about saving labor. It became about performance. Number 8. The hostess trolley. If you owned one of these, you understood exactly what it represented. A trolley on wheels, often with heated compartments, designed to keep an entire dinner party's food warm while it was wheeled from the kitchen into the dining room. It was not really about temperature control. It was about theater, about showing guests and neighbors that you had arrived, that your home was a place worth visiting. As more British families became homeowners through the 1970s, the hostess trolley became a quiet symbol of arrival, of climbing just one more rung on the social ladder. You can almost hear the small wheels squeaking across a carpeted dining room, carrying plates that had been kept warm through an entire round of drinks and polite conversation. It was in many ways a piece of stagecraft disguised as furniture. And like so much stagecraft, it eventually fell out of fashion the moment the performance it supported was no longer the point of an evening. Number 9. The fondue set. Fondue had been eaten in Switzerland for generations, but it found new life in New York City during the 1950s, brought there by a restaurateur named Conrad Egli. From there, the trend crossed the Atlantic and found its true home in British dinner parties of the 1970s. A communal pot of melted cheese or hot oil, long forks, and guests gathered close around the table. Fondue sets flew off the shelves during this decade. It was intimate, slightly dangerous, thanks to the open flame and hot oil, and it perfectly matched the decade's appetite for something new, something continental, something different from what their parents had done. There was a kind of quiet rebellion baked into that popularity. A generation raised on plain roasts and boiled vegetables suddenly gathering around melted cheese and a naked flame, forks crossing over one another, laughter growing louder as the wine disappeared. It was not really about the food at all. It was about permission. Permission to do something a little indulgent, a little foreign, a little unlike the kitchens their own parents had run. Number 10. The Foley food mill. Also known as a potato ricer, this simple hand-cranked tool pressed cooked potatoes, fruit or vegetables through a fine mesh, producing something smoother than any fork could manage. It became so trusted that it reportedly earned a place among the most treasured tools of the celebrated television cook Julia Child, who used it repeatedly on her cooking program. In 1982, after a change in ownership, the company that made these tools stopped producing them. And just like that, a kitchen staple quietly disappeared, remembered now mostly by collectors. There is something quietly poignant about a tool that outlasted its own company. Long after the factory stopped turning them out, these mills kept working in kitchens across Britain, passed from mother to daughter, still doing their one job perfectly decades after anyone stopped manufacturing them. Few objects on this list earned that kind of loyalty. Number 11. The Thaler flour shaker. Once made from basic utilitarian metal, this simple dredger for dusting flour onto a work surface got a colorful makeover in the 1950s and 60s, as manufacturers began producing bright, stylish bakeware aimed at style-conscious housewives. It seems almost too simple an idea to deserve its own moment in this list, and yet walk into most modern kitchens today, and you will not find one. Somewhere along the way we decided we no longer needed it, even though it did its one job perfectly. Number 12. The rabbit jelly mold. No birthday party in a British household during this era was complete without jelly. On an ordinary weekday it was made in a plain bowl, but for a birthday tea it needed shape, and often that shape was a rabbit, standing proudly at the center of the table, wobbling every time a child bumped the tablecloth. It was not really about the jelly itself. It was about the ritual, the anticipation, the small moment of magic a mold could create out of something so ordinary. Now here is the detail that connects almost everything on this list so far, and it is worth pausing on. Every one of these objects, the trolley, the fondue set, the jelly mold, existed to create an impression, to prove effort, to prove care. And the person expected to produce that impression, almost without exception, was a woman, quietly working behind the scenes so the final result looked effortless. Number 13. The butter churn. By the time we reached the middle of the 20th century, the butter churn had already become a relic in most British towns and cities, though it lingered on in rural households for years longer. Turning cream into butter by hand was ancient practice, dating back centuries, and its disappearance from ordinary kitchens marked one of the clearest lines between the pre-industrial home and the modern one. Few objects on this list represent such a complete and permanent departure from how we live now. Imagine the sound of it, the steady wooden thud repeated over and over, arms tiring long before the cream finally turned. For centuries, that sound was simply part of what a working kitchen sounded like. Then, within the space of a single generation, it vanished almost entirely, replaced by a block of butter picked up at the corner shop without a second thought. Number 14. The Teflon-coated saucepan. When non-stick cookware first appeared in British kitchens during the 1960s, it was treated as something close to space-age technology. Television programs of the era genuinely described equipment like this using that exact language, space age, because the idea of food simply sliding off a pan without sticking or burning felt like science fiction made real. It changed how an entire generation cooked breakfast. Scrubbing burnt egg off the bottom of a steel pan had simply been accepted, without question, as part of what cooking meant. Then, almost overnight, that particular chore quietly disappeared from millions of households. It is easy to overlook now, precisely because it worked so well and so completely that we forgot there was ever a problem to begin with. We are just past the halfway point, and there is still a run of items ahead that might be even harder to believe existed at all. But before that, remember, if any of this is stirring up memories, tell us which one in the comments. Hit subscribe if you have not already, and if someone in your life would enjoy taking this walk down memory lane with you, send this video their way. Number 15. The automatic kettle. It seems almost absurd to imagine a kettle that did not simply switch itself off, but for a long stretch of British history, that is exactly what every kettle was. A vessel you had to watch, or risk boiling dry on the stove. The automatic electric kettle, which switched off the moment the water reached boiling point, arrived as part of the same wave of 1960s innovation that brought Teflon pans and toasters into ordinary homes. It seems like the smallest of conveniences today. At the time, it eliminated one of the most common minor disasters of daily cooking. Number 16. The pressure cooker. In the years following rationing, when fuel and food both remained precious, the pressure cooker became a genuinely valued piece of equipment in British homes. It cooked tougher, cheaper cuts of meat in a fraction of the usual time, sealing in both flavor and nutrients under high pressure. For families still recovering financially from wartime shortages, it was not a novelty. It was a practical answer to a real problem, stretching both time and money further than an ordinary saucepan ever could. And yet, for all its usefulness, the pressure cooker earned a reputation as the single most feared object in the entire kitchen. Every household seemed to have its own story of the lid rattling ominously, or worse, of the day it did not behave, sending stew across the ceiling in a moment. Nobody in the family ever quite let anyone forget. Respect for that hissing valve was not optional. It was learned, usually the hard way, and passed down as a warning to the next generation. Number 17. The soda siphon. Sitting proudly on the sideboard rather than tucked away in a cupboard, the soda siphon was as much a piece of furniture as it was a kitchen tool. With a simple squeeze of the lever, it delivered a stream of fizzy water into a glass, ready to be mixed with squash, spirits, or cordial. It carried a slightly theatrical air, the kind of object that made even an ordinary afternoon drink feel like something a little more special. Number 18. The toast rack. Few objects say more about British domestic habits than this one. Rather than stacking toast in a pile, where the steam would soften it into something limp and disappointing, British households insisted on standing each slice upright in individual metal slots, allowing air to circulate and keep the toast properly crisp. It might be the single most quietly stubborn piece of British kitchen culture on this entire list, a small object built entirely around a single, very specific preference. Ask someone from almost anywhere else in the world why toast needs its own dedicated piece of tableware, and you are likely to get a confused look in return. But for generations of British families, cold, slightly limp toast was considered a genuine small tragedy, worth solving with purpose-built silverware. It is a strange kind of national pride, built on nothing more dramatic than crispness, and it has, remarkably, never fully gone away. Number 19. The sandwich toaster. 2 slices of bread, a filling pressed between them, and a hinged iron that sealed the edges while toasting both sides at once. It turned an ordinary sandwich into something closer to a hot pocket of cheese and ham, sealed shut like a small parcel. What started as a 1970s novelty for weekend lunches quietly became one of the most enduring items on this entire list, still sitting in cupboards across the country today, largely unchanged. There is a reason it survived when so many of these other objects did not. It never asked much of anyone. No hand cranking, no careful supervision, no risk of stew on the ceiling. Just bread, a filling, and a few minutes of waiting for that satisfying hiss of steam. Sometimes the gadgets that last are not the most impressive ones. They are simply the ones that never stopped being useful. And number 20. The spice rack. As the 1970s wore on, and British kitchens shifted toward warmer, browner color schemes, a small wooden or wire rack began appearing on countertops and walls, holding a modest collection of jars, paprika, oregano, curry powder, evidence of a country slowly opening itself up to flavors from beyond its own borders. It was a small object, but it marked something larger, a household finally willing to reach past the boiled, the roasted, and the entirely beige. For a country whose culinary reputation had long been built on simplicity, sometimes unfairly, that small rack of jars represented genuine curiosity. It suggested a household willing to be a little more adventurous on a Tuesday evening, even if that adventure amounted to nothing more daring than a curry powder tin bought on impulse and rarely finished. So there they are, 20 objects, 20 small decisions made in kitchens across Britain over 3 decades. Some of them, like the toast rack and the sandwich toaster, never really left us. Others, like the wall-mounted mincer and the butter churn, belong entirely to a world that no longer exists. But here is what I want you to sit with as this video ends. None of these gadgets were really about food. They were about time, and about who was expected to spend it. Every hour saved by a Kenwood chef or an automatic kettle was an hour that had, until then, simply been assumed to belong to someone else. That is the real story hiding inside 20 ordinary objects. Not nostalgia for its own sake, but a quiet record of how much changed, and how much never really did. Look at your own kitchen today, whatever decade you happen to be reading this from. Somewhere in it there is almost certainly a gadget doing quietly, invisibly, what used to take real effort and real time. We rarely stop to notice it, in the same way nobody in 1950 stopped to notice the rotary whisk as anything unusual. It was simply what a kitchen was. One day, some of what fills our kitchens now will feel just as strange, just as distant, to someone looking back the way we are looking back tonight. If you lived through even a handful of these years, you already know that some memories cannot be recreated, only remembered. So take a moment, think back to your own kitchen, your own mother's or grandmother's kitchen, and tell us in the comments which one of these 20 took you back the furthest. If this video meant something to you, give it a like, share it with someone who would understand exactly why, and subscribe, because there are many more of these stories still waiting to be told.